Okay, well, this is a video I've been wanting to do for quite a while now. So, if you're new around here, welcome. If you're not new around here, hey, good to see you again. The Legend of Zelda, probably my top favorite long-running video game franchise of all time. That being said, I have a lot of thoughts about the franchise and a lot to say about it. A lot of people might not know that because I only have like one Zelda video up prior to this recording, but do take note because from here and in the future going forward, you'll probably see a lot more Zelda videos from me. Today I want to talk about one of my favorite aspects from 3D Zelda games, and that is their dungeons. This is a really hard question to answer, but what is the best Zelda dungeon? I know you're probably typing something in the comments right now, but let's have a little discussion first, and then we can discuss in the comment section. Obviously, this is a very subjective topic. Everyone has their own opinions, and everyone has their own things that they want and need out of a Zelda dungeon. Me, of course, I have my own too, but looking at it this way raises the questions of what makes a dungeon good. And again, there's a lot of answers to that, and there honestly is no right answer. So I'm choosing to look at each dungeon as its own thing, what it was trying to accomplish, and if it accomplished it. On top of this, yes, I am going to have to add a little bit of subjectiveness in saying if it was fun that it accomplished what it was trying to accomplish. This still does boil down to being my opinion. Therefore, just please don't get mad at me, and you can just talk about it in the comments, and again, we'll discuss it in the comments after I discuss my views and why I think things are the way they are. I've handpicked a few dungeons from each 3D Zelda game, and I'm going to be going over them, but not in a ranking, just in the order that they appear in each game. Conversely, I won't be talking about the games in any specific order, just to keep things spicy or something. On that note, let's get started. The first game I want to look at is Ocarina of Time. This is one of those Zelda giants where just every dungeon is so solid that it's hard to pick just a few from it. But, I did it, somehow. Here's my choices in the chronological order that they appeared in the game. I could edit that out, but fuck all, I'm just gonna leave it in. Jabus Belly is my first on this list. I felt the need to include one of the child dungeons in Ocarina of Time, and it was honestly a really hard choice between these first three. But I picked Jabus Belly because it was the most unique location out of all of the child dungeons. On top of that, I have really fond memories of this dungeon, and every time I replay Ocarina of Time, I get really excited to redo this one. I know what you're all thinking, but this is the one where you have to carry the Zora girl. Yeah, that's true, and it can be annoying when you drop her, but I don't know. To me, it's one of those things that I really just love to hate. I still have a really good time in this big ol' fish tummy. I like these particular variety of enemies. I love how grotesque everything is, and every time you open a door, the walls, the floor, the ceiling, they're all moving around you the entire time. The boomerang is the weapon that you get in this dungeon, and it's really fun to play around with it, especially since it's the last time you get to before turning into an adult when you can't use the boomerang anymore. I really like that the boss was a parasite, and it, obviously fits the theme of the entire dungeon. The fight itself was pretty fun too, so no complaints there. Now, as this is pretty early in the game, you don't have a lot in your inventory to really shake things up, so inventory usage in this dungeon is relatively minimal. I guess this dungeon really gets most of its points for its feeling of uniqueness. It does stand out from the rest of the dungeons in the game, and even in the series in some ways. But I have a lot of dungeons to cover in this video, so I'm gonna go ahead and just move on for now. Next, let's talk about the Forest Temple. Yes, the first dungeon you get to as an adult in Ocarina of Time, and I just love how they took this idea for a forest temple and turned it into like a haunted mansion in the middle of the forest. That was always so intriguing to me, and honestly, one of these days we gotta get a backstory to this. It's so in depth too. You have the underground area, you have the courtyard, you have that ending area where you fight the boss, and it's like an art gallery or something. So obviously, I really love the aesthetic of this dungeon. The puzzles are good. I love the winding hallways, and the fact that it just made something that could have very easily felt like a fetch quest of finding and killing the pose, it made it interesting, and it didn't feel like a fetch quest. Ew, I sounded like IGN there. Anyhow, I feel like this dungeon didn't really make me feel like I was using my inventory to its fullest. Or maybe we were still limited at this point. I mean, this is the first dungeon that you do when you're an adult, and you can't use a lot of the items that you had as a child. So maybe it's just something like that really bothers me about it. Yeah, I really think that's it. In which case, I gotta give it props for giving use to 2 new items that you got for this dungeon, which were the hookshot and the bow and arrow. Both of which seem to be like complementary versions of making up for it not being able to use the boomerang anymore. And obviously you do get more uses out of them than you would have gotten from just using the boomerang anyway, such as the hookshot being able to take you closer to things and the bow and arrow just having way longer range. But you know what this dungeon did use to the fullest was the music. It's haunting. It's scary. I was scared when I played this because I was much younger and honestly kind of a little wuss. So it really marked its intended effect. Good for the developers. And yeah, that's really where most of the strength for the Forest Temple comes from. It's from the atmosphere, from the aesthetic, and it makes a very good first impression for your first adult dungeon in Ocarina of Time. Now let's move on to the second impression that you get as an adult in Ocarina of Time. Yep, the Fire Temple. Seriously, the game kept them coming when you turn into an adult. It's another remarkable dungeon just right after the last one. And this time I'll start by saying that the music also creates a very good atmosphere in this dungeon as well. Especially if you're one of the lucky few that has one of the earlier copies of the original N64 version, where there's like this really creepy chanting going on in the background, and I love it. If you haven't noticed already, I love scary and I love horror, and let me tell you, I think the Ocarina of Time devs were really pushing for that, because that's the effect it had on me. I also think this dungeon marked another step up in puzzles from the Forest Temple. Not only were there more of them, but I think they were just more complex in general. A lot of them are especially harder to pull off because they time you, and this is no easy dungeon to really get the layout on right away. It's kind of a maze, and there's like giant boulders and pillars of fire just chasing you and coming at you from every which way, so it's much more going on in this dungeon than in the last. While it's not the prettiest dungeon, it does serve its purpose in making you feel like you're in the middle of a volcano, so it succeeds there. And yeah, I will say the boss in this dungeon was one of the more memorable ones in Ocarina. And like, not in a bad way, like, it was good. It was a good boss, you know? The Water Temple! And no, I'm not joking. I really do think the Water Temple in Ocarina of Time 3D is one of the best dungeons in all of Zelda. That's right, folks. All the first 3 adult dungeons in Ocarina of Time made it onto this list. I thought they were all so good. And I think out of these 3, the Water Temple probably takes the cake for me personally, but definitely referring to the 3DS version. Now, I actually love the Water Temple in design, even on the N64, but obviously the limitations of that version really made it more of a slog than it actually, was intended to be. And that's mostly from having to flip through the pause menu, which took quite a while to load up on the N64 for those damn iron boots. The color coding of doors was also very useful in the 3DS version, so that's just another reason I want to look at that version in particular, because it really lets this dungeon shine for what it truly was and was meant to be, and that was the most complex dungeon in Ocarina of Time. This dungeon gets a lot of things right. It has a great aesthetic, great music that also sets up a creepy atmosphere just like the first 2 adult dungeons did. But the puzzles in individual rooms and then the puzzle of the overall dungeon being the water levels was just mwah. I loved it. And now that I don't have to flip through menus to put my iron boots on all the time, let me tell you, this was just amazing to go through on the 3DS. You also can't talk about the water dungeon without talking about the most iconic mini-boss in probably all of Zelda, I think. Yes, Dark Link. Not only are they memorable as fuck, but also the room that you meet them in was super cool, and the way that you meet them when you have to walk to the other end of the room and then turn around and then he's there, and then the music cues up, it's all just so genius. The boss of the entire dungeon, on the other hand, not so much. They were alright, but you can just camp in a corner and beat them, and it's kinda lame. So yes, the biggest aspect where this dungeon really shines was in its puzzles. And overarching puzzle. The fact that I can remember each individual room that had a puzzle is speaking a lot about this dungeon. I want to give special shoutouts to the Shadow and Spirit Temples, because they do something that none of the dungeons that I've already talked about do, and that is making you go back in time before having to come back as an adult. For the Shadow Temple, you had to go to the well in Kakariko Village, and for the Spirit Temple, well, you just had to go to the Spirit Temple as a kid and then also go as an adult. The Shadow Temple would be on this list, except it's separate from Under the Well. They're technically two separate dungeons, so when you're a kid, you're under the well, and I really like that one, but it's a little too short to mention. And then the Shadow Temple is longer, obviously, when you go back as an adult, but it's not as interesting in my opinion. I mean, it's also really cool, but it just doesn't strike me as one of the better Zelda dungeons. And then as for the Spirit Temple, when everything is all inclusive in the Spirit Temple between when you're a kid and when you're an adult, I just think that the puzzles in the Spirit Temple are kind of so-so. I don't really think any of them were that great. They weren't bad, but again, I don't think any of them really left a mark. So that does it for Ocarina of Time. Drumroll please if you can figure out which 3D Zelda game I'm going to talk about next. 3, 2, 1, okay, your time's up. Let's talk about Skyward Sword. This game and its dungeons are such a mixed bag. Contrary to how most people feel, I actually rather love the motion controls. That was never my issue with this game. My issue with this game lies in the first half of it being absolutely dreadful to go through, and the fact that every time I turn the game back on, it wants to do a big cutscene every time I pick up the smallest, most insignificant items on the world map. Thank you, Nintendo. In all seriousness though, it's really sad that the first half of this game is so bad, because the second half of Skyward Sword is utter bliss. Seriously, I know a lot of people that have missed out on some of the best dungeons that Zelda has to offer because the first half of the game turned them away. But here we are, and I'm gonna talk about 2 dungeons from Skyward Sword that were amazing, and definitely in the running for some of the best dungeons in 3D Zelda. If you have played Skyward Sword all the way through, you know where this is going. Let's talk about the Ancient Cistern. Is there anything bad to say about this dungeon? Because if there is, I'm at a blank here. This has got to be the most focused Zelda dungeon I've ever played through. Even from the first moment that you enter, I was just so shocked. I was not expecting this beautiful area. But sure enough, here it was in all its watery glory. Personally, I love the swimming in Skyward Sword once you get the dragon scale, and even if you weren't a fan of it up until this point, there's no reason to dislike its usage here, because you're basically just given these open pools of water that you can swim around in, and it's not required for you to really have to have strict timing to jump out like Zora Link style onto the land. At least not that I can remember. I just remember it helping me get around faster. To make matters even better, there's this huge contrast between the beautiful dungeon that you see when you enter and are mostly in, and then when you go underground and it's all this like dark and scary dead people coming out of the ground, and oh my god, that chase sequence out on the rope to get back up into the dungeon was amazing, and unforgettable. I legit had a panic attack getting chased up by those dead goblin thingies. Even better that the game is programmed to have at least one grab you, so it was just even more tense. That aside, there's not a single puzzle or room that's not fun to solve or even go through. And it only gets better once you get the dungeon's item, that being the whip, which is one of the most unique items in 3D Zelda that we've seen yet. Using it was always fun and super satisfying, and it was just always so accurate with how you moved your controller around for the motion controls. At least from my experience, or maybe I was just super talented with the motion controls for Skyward Sword, I don't know. I don't remember the gust bellows being used in any significant way, but it did seem to make me use a lot of the other stuff in my arsenal that I had up until this point, and I also had to use them in pretty creative ways, like attaching a bomb to my little bug flying thingy. But I'm honestly not going to complain about not using the gust bellows, because I never really liked it in the first place anyway. It works too slow, and it's boring, making it just a terrible product from the terrible first half of this game. Either way, this dungeon was wonderful. It constantly surprised me, it constantly kept me engaged, and it was nothing but topped off with one of the best boss fights in 3D Zelda at the end. There's another magnificent dungeon that exists in Zelda Skyward Sword. Again, who would have thought, right? But yeah, we all know it, we all love it. It's the Sand Ship. Another super unique take that Skyward Sword takes on one of its concepts. This time being time travel. And if you thought the path leading up to the ancient Cistern was fun and beautiful, the path leading up to this dungeon was super cool. The way that you are like on a ship going through this desert ocean that was like an ocean in the past, but now it's just a bunch of sand, and you just have this like radius around you where you're seeing the past and you're going through the water, but then you can still see the sand from the future or present time around that radius. Super cool, super unique, and it only continues when you get to the dungeon. The puzzles in the Sand Ship are super complex, and there's always this sense of intrigue every time you want to turn something back in time or put it back in the present. The way that each room changes when you do that is so significant in such cool ways that it never stops being really interesting. And that's really the visual luster for this dungeon. It's just seeing the contrast between the past and present. I loved every moment of it. It feels a little late, but you do get the bow and arrow in this level. And this is the most satisfying it has ever felt to use the bow and arrow. You literally hold the Wii Remote and nunchuck and pull back with the nunchuck as if you're pulling the string back on a real bow. It's so satisfying. And there's like this vibration that it does, and it feels so good. Never again have we ever seen the bow and arrow implemented this well into a Zelda game. On top of this, the mini boss as well as the final boss of the dungeon are both super cool and memorable. I honestly kind of want to know more about the pirate man that you have to fight, and honestly I also feel like there should be more to the like giant squid monster that you fight at the end. She just had such a cool design, although the fight itself was kind of boring. But that's enough about Skyward Sword for now. Let's move on to the game with the most solid lineup of dungeons in it. Twilight Princess. It's no secret that alongside Ocarina of Time, Twilight Princess is another giant where you have every single dungeon being amazing. But before I start getting too crazy on the overall praise, let's just go ahead and dive into the first dungeon I'm going to talk about. The Goron Mines. It's a super interesting mix of puzzles and shootout sections. There's also a surprising amount of visual variety. You have inside sections with a lot of water, or a lot of fire, or a lot of just magnet walls. Beyond that, there's a few outside sections too, like one where you have a bunch of utilities that you have to move around and jump into the magnets, and one where you just have this giant shootout while also trying to solve a puzzle. I was just always kind of shocked at how much there was in this one singular dungeon. The first time I played it, I was pretty mind blown. I guess I shouldn't have been too surprised since the first dungeon in Twilight Princess was surprisingly difficult, so coming here and there's so much going on, yeah, I really am not shocked anymore. But I am happy because these dungeons just showcase that there's gonna be a lot of quality ahead. Now, I will say though that while the final boss of this dungeon is really cool, it was really easy. And that is another thing that all the dungeons in Twilight Princess have in common, sadly. But at least some of the later ones were way more interesting in the way that you have to fight them. Either way, I've never seen so much blatant use of an item that you get in the dungeon. Like when they introduced the bow and arrow in this dungeon, I was like, okay, I'm gonna do a lot of shooting puzzles, but no, you legit have to have actual shootouts in this game, and it's great. On the other hand, the amount that we had to use the magnet boots could have been a little less, or at least the distance that you had to walk in them. That was definitely the slowest part of this dungeon, was putting on the magnet boots and having to walk from point A to point B, and it took kind of forever. But alas, let's move on to the next Twilight Princess dungeon that I want to talk about. Arbiter's Grounds. This one did so much right. I remember being younger and legitimately scared of going through this dungeon because when I first walked into it, it set up this really dark, scary atmosphere, and I quickly ran out and took forever to go back in to complete it. But when I did, it was great. For one, this dungeon did something really amazing, and that was making quicksand fun to get through and not annoying. I really like the way it's implemented here. Like, you can't stand on it too long, but you have to go grab that chain and pull it. It's not difficult per se, but it does add a feeling of intensity, and I like that because Skyward Sword did the complete opposite and made quicksand really annoying. The Poe fetch quests makes its return, and once again, it doesn't feel like a fetch quest. It feels fun to get to them, find them, and kill them, and then bring them back to move on. I really like the use of darkness in these levels, where you have to light lanterns in order to see the entire room. You also have to turn into wolf form and use your senses a lot, which is also really cool since now is the first time that you have that ability to use in a dungeon. And yeah, overall the puzzles are pretty solid in this level, and I especially love the spinner. It really brings the puzzles up another notch once you get it. And just like the whip from Skyward Sword, it's one of the cooler, unique weapons that you're gonna get in any Zelda game. Beyond that though, how you get it is really cool too, because the mini-boss in this dungeon is super memorable, super cool, super scary, and it was really fun to fight. Which leads me to also talk about the boss of the level, which is one of my favorites in Twilight Princess. Again, while it's not difficult per se, it's really fun. Surfing on the sand to hit the gooey center, and then also just spinning around on the spinner on the second phase to hit him in the air. So fun. The design and premise of this boss is really cool too. I was, once again, legitimately scared when Zant came in and started bringing it back to life. Moving on again though, let's talk about Snow Peak Temple, or Snow Peak Ruin, Snow Peak Mansion. What's this one technically called? Whatever, don't matter. It's a really cool snow dungeon, okay? And it takes place in, once again, a giant mansion. But this time it's even cooler than the Forest Temple from Ocarina of Time. My favorite part about this dungeon is how unconventional it feels. I was really confused at first if I was even in a dungeon, and then, yeah, once you're given the map, it turns out you are. I love the contrast of the calm peacefulness of being around the Yetis and then being in the rest of the dungeon. Like, these two have no idea what's going on around them, or maybe they just don't care because these things don't want to, you know, attempt to kill them. Maybe because the Yetis are super strong, I don't know, but it's still super fun and cool either way. So the female Yeti is trying to guide you to find, I think it was like the boss key, but she keeps getting ingredients for her stew, which may or may not have been on purpose the entire time. It's cute. It's real cute. And I mean, hey, thanks to her, we get to see this wonderful abode. All the rooms and areas in this dungeon had something really fun about them. And also, for some reason, there's cannons in this mansion, so I guess it must have been some sort of, like, fort as well. So there's plenty of puzzles having to do with shooting things. But it gets real cool once you get the ball and chain. While the mini-boss himself wasn't super memorable, the fact that he was swinging this thing around at you the entire fight made it stick in my mind. And then you get to take it? What? Amazing! Let's just say I didn't only use the ball and chain in this dungeon, I used it everywhere afterwards. On top of this, the boss fight is actually one of the harder ones in the game in my opinion. Maybe it's just because I'm bad at ice levels where there's slippery ice, but I had a little bit of trouble. Not to mention that one scene. Yeah, you know, that one scene. Yep, well, while the puzzles were really solid, and I really liked the weapon that you get in this level, obviously the real shiner here is the aesthetic, which even by itself makes this feel like a really unique experience. As we continue on to the next dungeon though, let's just take a moment to realize that Twilight Princess up until this point has done a really good job at having a sense of scale with every dungeon, but none of them have a larger scale than City in the Sky. Yes, this dungeon is marvelous to behold. You're way up high above the clouds, there's a deadly wind blowing that can blow you off at any moment. There's a feeling that a lot has happened here in the past, like there was a civilization that lived here, and of course this is further confirmed to be Skyloft from Skyward Sword. Skyloft, was that what it was called? I'm pretty sure that was it. But this feeling of scale is only amplified when you get the item of the dungeon being the double claw shot. Cause now you're like Spider-Manning on these platforms up in the sky and it's just so epic and I love it. The music also does a good job of making you feel like everything that you're doing is counting, because you could fall off at any moment and it could be the end. Speaking of counting though, we could have done without those segments where you have to wait on the fans to get to the next fan, because that took way too long and no one likes waiting. But you know, it's fine, because a lot of it makes up for that, especially so when you get to the boss. Sticking with our theme of not being hard to beat, but being super fun and cool to fight, this is definitely one of the most memorable boss fights in Zelda history. And it takes full advantage of the scale. So once again, this is another dungeon that wins out a lot of its luster by its aesthetic, while also providing some clever puzzles and a lot of fun platforming. It even makes you use a few of the more niche items that you've acquired so far, like the iron boots and the spinner. So all in all, really good. But there is one final dungeon in Twilight Princess that kind of perfects the things that we've been seeing so far in all these other dungeons. Yes, and it is the final dungeon of the game, Hyrule Castle. Once again, is there anything bad we can say about this dungeon? Every room and area was a joy to go through. As a whole, Hyrule Castle reuses a lot of the concepts we've seen in the previous dungeons and just does them in different, more focused ways. You really have to use everything in your arsenal that you've earned up until this point. And don't get me wrong, Ganon's castle from Ocarina of Time did something similar, but something about the flow of this dungeon just felt so much more natural. A big part of that might also be because, just like Snow Peak Temple, it kind of felt like you're not even in a dungeon the entire time. Ruins. Snow Peak Ruins. I gotta stop saying temple. Whatever. So yes, you're using everything that you have at your disposal in Hyrule Castle. And once you get to the end of your journey, you are blessed with the best Ganon boss fight I've ever played through in any 3D Zelda game. There was what, like 4 phases in this fight? And each one did something really right. My favorite phase personally was the horseback fight, but that's not to say I didn't enjoy the other phases either. I guess the weakest one would be Puppet Zelda, but even then, there's this whole, sense of dread having to fight Zelda's body. It also kind of seemed like she was dead and this was just like some sort of necromancy going on. Scary stuff, man. Scary stuff. But yes, where Hyrule Castle really shines is making you use everything in your arsenal. It's the epitome of a final dungeon. And finally, we are moving on from Twilight Princess. I really should edit out that voice crack. The Wind Waker. There's really only one dungeon in the Wind Waker that I can talk about. Most of the dungeons in this game were just forgettable. Like, literally, I can't remember most of them. But there is one that always sticks in my mind that left a really good impression. The Earth Temple. It's honestly crazy how big the divide is here, because I didn't really care for any of the other dungeons in Wind Waker, but it's also really hard to say anything negative about the Earth Temple. Okay, I take that back. I guess you could say something negative about the boss fight in this one, but the dungeon itself is pretty flawless. It's one of the most unique, seeing as to how you're controlling another character and having to use two characters for the puzzles in this 3D space, which is something I don't think we've seen in any other 3D Zeldas. I know we've seen it in 2D Zeldas like Treasure Tracker, Spirit Tracks. But these puzzles are so good, and getting to fly around a little bit when you play as the bird girl is great too. What was her name again? God, this game was so forgettable. Medea or some shit? Yeah, Medea. I guess another negative you could say about the Earth Temple is that it doesn't look visually good at all. And honestly, there's no reason that it couldn't have looked good. Like, they could have given it some sort of aesthetic flair, but they just didn't. But again, the real shiner of this dungeon is its puzzles, and in turn, the shakeup of controlling two characters. Moving right along, we're gonna talk about Majora's Mask next. I don't want to call this game a giant like Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess because it has way less dungeons, obviously, but I will say that every dungeon in this game is in the running for best dungeons in 3D Zelda. But once again, I've somehow narrowed it down to just 2 dungeons, because as close to perfect as Woodfall and Snowhead Temple are, these other 2 are just doing far more as a whole. So let's start with the Great Bay Temple. Sticking to what 3D Zelda water dungeons do best, you have a labyrinthian design. But this time, you actually have a lot more to do with swimming, which funny enough was something we don't really see much of in the series. Usually water dungeons have more to do with water levels than swimming itself. But Great Bay Temple has to do with water currents, which I think is a great switch up. Yeah, and we all know that Zora Link is the best swimming we've ever gotten in a 3D Zelda game, so it was pretty glorious to have a whole dungeon designed around that. Of course, I am speaking strictly about the original version because the 3DS version botched both the swimming and the boss fight for this one. The mini-boss is always fun though. Majora's Mask just does such a generally good job though of keeping every moment-to-moment gameplay of its dungeons packed with things to do. Which makes perfect sense as you're under a timer, and Great Bay is just the most fun in those moment-to-moment gameplays, especially when you're trying to collect stray fairies. There's really not much else to say about it except that some of the spaces can be a little too tight for the swimming, but again, you don't have to swim fast every time, so it's fine to me. Next, we have the Stone Tower Temple, which in Majora's Mask fashion is also packed with things from moment to moment. But this time we have a really cool gimmick of flipping the entire place upside down. This mixes things up for puzzles in ways you can't even imagine until you play through it. Once again too, as this is the final dungeon of the game if you don't count the moon, you're using everything at your disposal. And since this is Majora's Mask, that means using all of your transformation masks. And yes, plenty more Zora swimming. Yay! Once again, I'm going to refer to the original version because the 3DS version botched the boss fight in this one too. But in both versions, you get the amazing dungeon music, which I think is my favorite music in all of 3D Zelda dungeons. I should probably research that and make a video about it too. Anyways, that does it though. That's all the dungeons I have to— Oh wait. Yo, I legit almost forgot about Breath of the Wild. I mean, I guess it is a 3D Zelda game. And how could I forget? It has the best, just kidding. It isn't that bad. I guess if I really had to pick one in all seriousness, I would pick Vomido. I just think that one was the one that I had the most fun with, you know, working with the air tunnels and tipping the bird over in different ways and playing around with that to get what I needed to get done. But obviously Breath of the Wild isn't about the dungeons themselves, so I'm gonna give it a break this time and I'm just gonna pick Vomido. But obviously Breath of the Wild's entire map is kind of like one big dungeon, so we'll just leave it at that. Also, I hope this doesn't sound like I'm hating on Breath of the Wild. I fucking love that game. So, now that we've gone over all these dungeons, which one is the best? Was it City in the Sky? No, I don't think so, because you had all of those waiting segments. So then, was it the Great Bay Temple? I guess swimming could get a little clunky in that one, so no. Okay, then how about Stone Tower Temple? Because I did mention that Majora's Mask has the most to do from moment to moment in each of its dungeons. But every time I had to play the Elegy of Emptiness, the game kinda came to a halt. And unlike Hyrule Castle from Twilight Princess, the puzzles that used everything in your arsenal did not feel as focused. Okay, but what about Arbiter's Grounds? Well, the dungeon itself is really fun, and the boss and mini-boss are really fun to fight too, but every time you had to fight one of those Poes, that was some boring-ass fighting. It's kinda just a 1, 2, 3 hit them dead, but then you also have to wait in between that 1, 2, 3, so it's just kinda not very fun. And seeing as to how you have to do that 4 times, yeah, that bogs it down a little bit. Okay, but what about the Water Temple from Ocarina of Time? Hear me out. You know, I mentioned this has the best mix of puzzles from room to room as well as the overarching puzzle of the entire dungeon being the water levels. And the 3DS version did fix a lot of the issues that the dungeon originally had. But between the underwhelming boss and the fact that the game can come to a complete halt if you missed one thing, I'd say this ain't it, Chief. Okay, well there's always Snow Peak. After all, I didn't have any complaints about that one. But that's the thing, the puzzles were just solid, they weren't anything great. Also, every time you had to do a puzzle with the cannons, it was really slow and kinda boring. Okay, but Johnny, what about the Earth Temple, Ancient Cistern, Sandship, and Hyrule Castle? You didn't say anything bad about those, and you were wondering if there was anything negative to say about them in the first place. And to that I'd say, holy fuck, you're right. That's a good-ass question. What is there negative to say about these? Well, okay, I'll start with the Earth Temple. I guess the only negative is the boss? Oh, and now that I think about it, that's the same issue that the Sandship has. Cool bosses, but kind of boring in practice. I didn't really have fun beating them. At least, not compared to some others. And that just leaves us with 2 very close choices. The Ancient Cistern from Skyward Sword, and Hyrule Castle from Twilight Princess. I have to really dive into the smallest details here, and I guess when looking at Hyrule Castle, it did make me fight those flying fucks with the claw shot shields once too many. Who, by the way, I have to wait for them to put their shield up to claw shot it, whereas there's no issues like that in the Ancient Cistern. Matter of fact, every enemy you fight, whether it be the regular enemies, the mini-boss, or even the boss themselves, all kept me constantly engaged. Yeah, you know what? Yeah! Ancient Cistern has everything. It's super focused, it's one of the most visually stunning pieces, and there's even a flying enemy that you have to like grapple down with the whip, but you don't have to wait for them to do that, you just throw the whip out at them. And you don't even have to hit them as many times because they're not a mini-boss. Yeah, and you can swim around kinda like Zora Link. That's always fun. This dungeon is fast-paced, focused, and fun, and you can't really ask for more. So, it gets from me the stamp of best 3D Zelda dungeon of all time. Who would have thought? Skyward Sword. Oh, what a mixed bag. Okay, now's the time when you guys can type down in the comments, say whatever the fuck you want, because I want to hear what the fuck you have to say. While you're at it though, hit the subscribe button, and I'm gonna take the time to thank my patrons. Seriously, it means a lot that you guys are supporting me right now, especially during this tough time and while I'm not really able to record much. Here's to our future, and anyone else who wants to support me, please feel free. I have all the links in the description, or they'll pop up at the end of this video. I also have all my social medias linked if you guys want to have a more intimate experience with me. Wait, like the friendship kind, you know, not like intimate, you know what I mean. Anyhow, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.